Call Scott Christopher.
Here.
Craig Daniel.
Here.
Brian Eastridge. Angela Fisher. Mary Frost.
Here.
Welcome. Mary's a new member. Jackie Gronduck.
Here.
Ruben Lopez. Ruben is also a new member. Jose Ortiz.
Here.
Jim Parisi. I thought they went off. Lisa Price.
Here.
Craig Ryan. David Reeves. David Smith.
Here.
Dr. Ronald Stewart. Deborah Tappan.
Here.
So we have two of our new members here. Would y'all like to introduce yourself and where you're from and your experience in the trauma system? Mary, we'll start with you.
I'm Mary Frost. I'm the Assistant Director for Pediatric Trauma and Injury Prevention at Texas Children's. I've been involved in the, no one can hear me, who knew? I've been involved in the Texas trauma system since 1998 when my first facility designated was a level 4. So I really am looking forward to serving on the committee and I'll be able to hear now that I'm up here.
I'm Deb Tappan. I'm the Chief Nursing Officer at Culberson Hospital in Van Horn, Texas. I'm also the trauma coordinator there, and we are a level 4 facility. And I'm very excited to be a part of GETAC. I want to represent the rural hospitals and the remoteness and the special issues that we encounter being so far away from our level 1 and level 2 trauma hospitals.
We have 8 out of 16. Does that make a quorum for us to be able to move forward with discussion? Jane.
I'm sorry.
We have 8.
We have 9.
We have 9?
Do we not count you?
Sorry, 9. 9 out of 16. We have a quorum. We can move forward.
Good.
Okay. Just for a show of hands, how many of you were at the November meeting? So this discussion is going to pick right back up after that November meeting. So after the November meeting, we met in Dallas in January. And if you remember in the November meeting, there were 4 items that the Trauma Systems Committee recognized and identified as issues that needed to be addressed. And so the first issue was the PI process. In the old criteria, there were recommendations of specific audit filters or mandated audit filters for the level 3 and for the level 4. So that was one issue we need to pick back up on. The second issue that we recognized, looking at some of the data that we pulled out of the state registry, was a need to create a process for validation of data. The third issue was the opportunity to look at specifically geriatric trauma. And then the fourth and fifth issues, the fourth one was injury prevention. If you remember the data that we showed you, there were items that were fell out as high injury rates for ECodes and age, and so we looked at those. And then the last one was the DWI overall at a state level, what the opportunities for reduction. I didn't do that, or to address that. So that's where we're going to pick back up. So before we get started, is Wanda Hegelson or Eric Epley in the room?
I think they're still in
The disaster? The reason I'm asking is because we need a thumb drive that has the proposed RAC criteria on it. So if one of, I texted, I emailed her, so if somebody would tackle one of them when they come through the door and ask, gently tackle. So we're going to move right into number 1. We're going to go through the PowerPoint. Miss Dinah Welch is picking up copies for everybody, so if you'll just hang tight, we'll get you copies. So the first thing, again, that we took in the November meeting, this was one of the issues that we identified. This is the overview. And so if you remember, these are the performance standards that we identified for the trauma centers. So the things that were recommended to be changed was the 2-hour time frame for transfer. There was a debate on the pediatric side. The pediatric facilities recommend that it's 2 hours from the time the injury is identified. The rest of the group wants it to be 2 hours from arrival, and then you would set like an 80% threshold for that. And so the discussion and the recommendation was to go ahead and change it to 2 hours after arrival to the trauma center. Any questions on that? So if you'll notice, what's written in red is what the recommendations were. So Lisa, Scott, anybody that was there, Dr. Ryan's not here, Deb, any comments, please jump in. So if you'll notice down to the bottom, the delayed transfer, and again, that's going to be defined as 2 hours after arrival at the facility. There was a recommendation to add the delayed movement to the OR and define that as stat cases only. And then delayed diagnosis. Delayed diagnosis wanted to define that as an overread or need for further evaluation. And then a missed injury is defined as greater than 24 hours or after hospital discharge. Any committee members have any comments?
Jory, just to, I think we missed a step right here. Just to refresh the audience, what happened is we presented these standards as they're written in black at the November meeting. The Trauma System Subcommittee had a meeting in Dallas, 2 weeks ago, something like that?
January.
And that's where the wording in red came up from that Trauma System Subcommittee. So that's why you're seeing, if you have strong recollection from November, that's why you're thinking, I've never seen that before. So that's how it got to where it is today.
I have one question on the delayed transfers, again, probably bringing up the PD thing, is how are the surveyors going to handle that when you have a kid that's arrived to the ER who's come in under other auspices, and 2.5 hours later you figure out the kid's got a skull fracture and a subdural and a humerus fracture and some other things. How are the surveyors going to handle that with the, at the time of survey? Because it will have violated this rule, even though the kid looked perfectly fine and was here for poor feeding and, various other complaints.
The discussion at the meeting was that you would identify that in your PI process, and based on the patient's presentation and the process, the trauma center would define whether or not they felt that was appropriate managed, or if there were opportunities to improve or to streamline that process. And a lot of the cases that Lori brought up and other people brought up are cases that most likely would be reviewed and felt like it was appropriate based on the clinical presentation of the patient on arrival.
Okay, good, just as long as they've got some out for that.
Anybody else have any questions on these?
What is your definition for stat case?
When the physician says this is a stat case.
Can I ask a clarification, since I wasn't at that meeting? For the greater than 2 hours after arrival, you're talking about transfers, or, we've got like a nationwide boarding problem, and I'm going to just talk hips that have to sit in the ER because I got no beds in the hospital. Is that's not including them, or it's an unrealistic expectation in today's environment that I'm going to get everybody out into? Not transfers. I'm not talking about. I'm talking
This is
about
just
admissions.
transfers.
Okay,
Hospital transfers.
I wasn't stating my case.
These are just hospital transfers. Dr. Daniel, there was a lot of discussion about that and how do we define that, and the basic recommendation was when the physician says this is a stat case.
But you can't always find that documented in the records when you're reviewing them.
How would you recommend we define it? You're a surgeon. How would you like to define that, you and Dr. Smith?
Exploratory laparotomy that takes longer than 2 hours with the blood pressure systolic or less than 90.
I know the ACS criteria says if the patient arrives hypotensive, they should be in the OR within an hour.
Right.
So there was discussion about that criteria.
The patient's stable, and also, there's probably going to be different criteria versus if it's a craniotomy versus exploratory laparotomy.
That's the reason we decided the best language was when the physician says this is a stat case. Anybody else on the committee have any discussion on that? Any recommendations? Dr. Smith, you had language you wanted to propose?
No, actually, I kind of like the stat case, because what we're really looking at is whether the hospital can mobilize adequately, not whether the physician's making the right call.
that's covered in other areas.
Anybody from the audience want to comment on that? No? So those were the performance standards. So this would be the recommended event review. So if one of these standards were not followed, it would initiate an event review. So the first one that the group wanted to add specifically related to the geriatric was failure to screen for anticoagulation therapy, and if positive, to obtain an INR. In the old document, there was a reintubation criteria, and they wanted to change that language from reintubation to failed extubations. And then the next one, there was some question about death of trauma patients. There was a lot of discussion about, does everyone have to be audited? Does that mean, does it mean to go to peer review? And so we just wanted to add the language that they all have to be screened, but not all require peer review based on the medical director and your protocols. So those were the recommendations for this particular slide. Does any committee members have any comments?
That's good.
Anybody from the audience? And then the liaison follow-up, Dr. Ryan, this was your activity at the November meeting. And there is still need to clarify the language. What's the criteria for the non-boarded physician that's serving in that liaison or trauma medical director or trauma surgeon role? So we're going to ask you to look at that and bring back a recommendation for the May meeting.
You're talking to me, right?
Yes, sir.
You said Dr. Ryan, sorry.
Oh, sorry, Dr. Daniel.
Okay.
The next issue, if you remember, out of the 5 was to look at the trauma registry validation, and you'll see some of that data when you see the PowerPoint. It's still included in the PowerPoint program. So the goal was to define procedures that need to be in place to ensure accurate, complete data prior to submission to the state. And then the next issue was to define state procedures. So Lisa, Scott, one of you, Deborah, want to walk through this slide?
Well, let's see. The first goal is define procedures that need to be in place to ensure accurate, complete data to submission to the state. And then we talked about state procedures, adding language that requires, if the registry submission has errors, that there are to be corrections within 30 days. What we were talking about there is there would, at the state level, there would be a process in place that if a patient's data set was sent and there was errors, not necessarily warnings, but errors, that the clock starts ticking and the registry system would somehow monitor that those corrections were made within 30 days. Trauma Data Bank has established a standard for error validation. The error reporting needs to meet the National Trauma Data Bank. So that's just making sure our state trauma registry at least meets the standards of the National Trauma Data Bank. State will provide quarterly statistical reports 2 weeks prior to the GETAC meetings. And do we have future slides that talk about some of the reports we talked about, or? Okay, so you'll see those in a minute. Equipment and software needs. Some of the discussion that we had in January on that is let's say some rogue software vendor came in and wanted to lowball the cost on his trauma registry, that he'd at least have to meet the defined standards and performance criteria for the Texas State Trauma Registry. State Registry will conduct biannual meetings with vendors to verify that the data dictionary is current. Again, that's just kind of keeping everybody on the same page. All the data fields meeting the National Trauma Data Bank at least, if not exceeding that, and again, making everybody on an even playing field. Define educational needs for the trauma program manager, trauma registrar. Again, that's at the state level. That would be in the rule. The American Trauma Society Trauma Program Manager course would be recommended. Define priority needs and evaluate the state procedures. So that's at the state level. Questions, comments? Audience? Registrars in the audience? Okay.
Yes.
Don't even talk until you get to the microphone.
I think covering as far as these state errors, it should also include the warnings because I can go through all my data fields and put in unknowns. Those will come up as warnings. When you have that data validation, you won't be able to tell the difference between your error and warning.
Okay. Good comment. Good recommendation.
You got to talk louder, yeah.
And I guess I would need to know which definition you all are using for your, that we were talking.
Tammy,
That comes from
can you see if that microphone's turned on? They're saying they can't hear you in the audience.
Can you hear me now? Yeah. Okay. Find it.
Okay. Sorry about that. So anyway, what I was saying is I would have to know what a definition of error means so that I can be on the same page with you for setting this up. I don't see any problem at all with the NTDB. We have modeled all of our questions exactly off of how they ask them, so that should be very easy. Of course, I would need more information about what type of statistical reports that you're wanting to have. I don't think there's probably any problem with that. Equipment and software needs, I'm not really sure that we have ever defined that before. We have defined how the file needs to be formatted that's sent to us. So,
And I think that's kind of what we were talking about there.
okay. Biannual meetings with vendors to verify the data dictionary is current. We can discuss what that means, because basically what all the vendors are concerned about is if they're creating their file correctly. What we have noticed, just so you all can share our experience, is that the vendors are changing, customizing their software. They're not communicating that with DSHS. And many times when we've had a problem with a file being accepted or not, it's because of that. And then we have also gotten into this loop, never-ending loop, of the vendor telling his customer that DSHS changed something and that's why their file's not being accepted. And then of the customer being the hospitals then calling us and saying, you have to fix this. Us calling the vendor and saying, there's something different about your file that needs to be fixed. And I've tried to get some very direct communication with that. But to be honest with you, we probably need to partnership on our approach to these vendors. They are not all that, not all of them, but some of them are not open to admitting when there has been a problem with the program that they have written. And they are not wanting to be forthright and communicate that with their customers. So we probably need some help on that. I'm not sure, define the educational needs for a trauma registrar and a, what's a TPM?
Trauma Program Manager.
Okay, and so you want DSHS to do that?
Well, through the trauma designation rules, we were
Okay.
trying to address that.
Okay. ATS, program manager, course recommended, okay. Define priority needs, evaluate state procedures. So I'm not sure what, evaluate state procedures is pretty broad, so I would just need more detail on some of those things, Shori.
I think the bottom line that we're trying to get to is, you guys were very gracious for the November meeting to provide data, and when you start looking at that data, it's very clear that there's some opportunities to validate information. And so one of our tasks was to go back and come back with recommendations of how to address that. And so these are the recommendations that we're bringing back from this committee for the discussion with the audience and discussion with you and discussion with the state of how to improve the data. And so one of the big issues was it was identified that you can get error reports back and you never have to correct them. And you can just continue to move forward. You can send data and get back a report that says your data is full of errors, and the hospital is never held accountable to correct that data. So that was one of the first things that we felt like, hey, there's a problem there, we got to fix that. And so tag to that would be not only the errors, but the warnings that was already brought up. There was a lengthy discussion on that. And so the biggest issue was, how do we validate the data as it goes into your registry, and then validate the correction has been corrected. Some of these other issues we've already addressed through the new rule language. So I just wanted to open it up and see if anybody else in the audience had any questions.
Can I ask you one other thing? If we can get some definition of the within 30 days of what? If it's 30 days from when you submitted your file, or 30 days past the 45 days. You know, we've been talking about changing some of the rules for Chapter 103. And one of them that we have discussed is changing that a facility would be asked to report their patients 45 days after the date of discharge. So if we got them then, if you're saying that from when you submitted your file, 30 days after that, you have to make the corrections.
30 days after you send us a warning. We have warnings or errors. Once 30 days after we get that notice, we have to correct the date and resubmit it.
Okay, because another thing to consider then in that, Jory, is that we are also asking in our rules, one of our proposed changes is that every entity submits a file once a month. So that will be for cases 45 days past discharge date, but that the data is sent more routinely than what we are getting it now. That way you're not sending, 6 months, 12 months worth of data all at one time, which, believe it or not, does happen, and getting all your error reports back and then in 30 days having to correct those. Thank you.
Thank you. Lisa, Deb, you were there. Any other comments? Dr. Smith?
I think one thing that we need to look at is, it says add language about what she was just talking about. Are we going to hold this, do we have something that holds the state to a standard? We submit the data, they have X amount of time to get it back to us and say you need corrections. I think we probably need to define that if we haven't.
That's what that last bullet is applying, but I'm not familiar with how to hold the state accountable.
Or at least give them goals.
Those error reports come back fairly quickly. I mean, when you've submitted, the error report you get back is within a day or
It's
so.
a workflow in our system that we're building, for instance. It also is a workflow in the current system. In the system we're building, when your records are submitted, they're processed at a much quicker rate than the current system, which basically the reason why the system has had problems at some times is because it only processes one record at a time, believe it or not. And so the new system will be doing that differently. So when you submit your file, as soon as all those records have been processed, which ought to be in very much real time, then you will automatically get an email back telling you to go look at your dashboard and see the records that did not pass the validation test that had errors.
Can I ask you one more question?
Sure.
And I'm not saying I don't believe it. People are putting like 6 months, a year's worth of data at one time, not submitting, because our rule says you have to have it 45 days after discharge.
Right.
How are they held accountable for that?
They haven't been in the past, and the reasoning behind that has been because the system has had so many issues. How do you hold people accountable? So if the system is down for months at a time, which it has been in the past, they've not been held accountable.
My question is when things happen and the new registry says, are people going to be held accountable to staying within that 45 days from the date of discharge, getting their submission?
Yes, we are going to be communicating this very broadly, not only to the entities who have not reported, but also with the Office of EMS and Trauma Services, for who we are not receiving data from. And we will be taking the appropriate action if they are not meeting the requirements of their designation or the requirements of the law for reporting injuries to Texas.
Okay, thanks.
Any other comments about this particular slide? Now, this is the data that we got, so I included it just so you'll remember. In addition to that, one of the issues that was identified in the process was that PI was the #1 reason that people had to repeat a survey. And so we looked at, from the group that was there in January, opportunities. So the topic course is available, and so one of the recommendations is to encourage the trauma medical directors to attend the topic course and develop how-to cases. So you take a case and you create those examples. So the group is working on that. And then this is the data that was reviewed. So this is the data came from these centers. I'm just going to go through this really fast. You have a copy of it. This is exactly what we reviewed in November. Everybody okay? You don't have a PowerPoint copy? Okay, so does that mean you want me to slow down on this? So you can see from the conditions, the non-fatal, 85,000, fatal injuries, approximately 3,200. Those that were invalid, 450, and that's why we're talking about data validation, is because we were unable to use that data to make decisions. And so the sum of the charges, you can see it's pretty self-explanatory. So we looked at the top E-codes, and you can see fall, unspecified fall, motor vehicle crash, and fall again. Those are the top 4 E-codes that were reported through the trauma registry. If you looked at the top 5 fatal injuries, you saw fall, motor vehicle crash, assault, other transportation, so that would be your ATV, go-kart type things, and then the struck. And if you looked at the 4 most frequent E-codes for fatal injury, again, you saw fall, unspecified fall, motor vehicle crash, motor vehicle crash. And again, if you looked at the top 5 E-codes for fatal injury, you saw motor vehicle crash, fall, assault, suicide, and other transportation. For the non-fatal injuries by age group, you can see the breakdown. And the interesting thing is if you look at injuries, the population from 26 to 65, you'll see that makes up the majority of the injuries that we're reporting. Fatal injuries by group, again, you can see the highest death rate is going to be in that 26 to 65 again. And then if you look at motor vehicle crash fatalities, you can see alcohol related. This is just to drive home the point we need in Texas to look at DWIs. This is the information from the Operation Freedom of the fatalities from up to 2010. There were 1,317 people killed that were U.S. citizens. And we kill about 1,300 every year on the streets from alcohol crashes. ISS reporting hospital, you can see the breakdown, the frequency. Again, you can see there's 9,996, 10 to 15, 9,206, 16 to 24, and then greater than 25, 9,598. And then the ISS by different trauma centers, so you can see level ISS rank in the first column, and then level 1 trauma centers, level 2, level 3, level 4, and then the non-designated. So there was a lot of question about non-designated. You know, where are those coming from? Are those hospitals in pursuit? And we were unable to get all the answers on that. And then average length of stay in the trauma centers, you can see by ISS, level 1, 2, 3, and 4. You can see in 0 to 9, it's pretty much the same. 10 to 15, you'll see some changes. And then 16 to 24. So there were a lot of questions, were those patients being transferred out after being admitted? What was the outcome of those patients? And then looked at geriatric trauma. And as you can see, there were 25,175 that were included. You can see there was 9. They didn't know if they were male or female. Just goes home to drive home that we need validation. It's pretty easy to find that. And then 2,670 geriatric incidents were included. 28 females, 42 males. You can see the breakdown, male versus females. And then the incidence by age. And if you'll notice, the age from 102 over to like 130. Again, if there's a Texan that's 130, they'd be in the Guinness Book of World Records, right? So the thing to take home here is the need for the validation. And then cases by RAC, so you can see a lot of questions that we don't have regarding the geriatric patient population is who includes geriatrics for certain injuries and who doesn't. Are there certain RACs that are encouraging that? Certain trauma centers that are doing that? So you can see Trauma Service Area E, G, O, P, Q, and V have a pretty high percentage of inclusion. And then you can see the case incidents by RAC and gender. Again, you can see the breakdown. Sorry guys, we outlive you. And then you can see the case fatality by age. And then this is the 2009 data. You can see the ISS unknown. And then Tammy and her group just shared last week the 2010 data. So you can see there's 1,356 records in the geriatric, and geriatrics defined as 65 or older. And you can see the breakdown of the injury severity, the ECodes, falls, motor vehicle crash, fall, and then motor vehicle crash. So you'll see time and time again it's falls and motor vehicle crashes, with falls leading the motor vehicle crashes. This is just different data. So geriatric trauma, again, the question after looking at this in the November meeting, one of the tasks back to this group was, can elements be added to the recommended geriatric trauma facility criteria? So take the current trauma criteria and add geriatric specific criteria. And so there's a document that you have, some of you have. This is not the correct document. We did actually go through that. So if you have the minutes that look like this and has January 24th and 25th, you'll see there is some recommendation towards those language. Lisa was gracious enough to take the minutes at that meeting. And so again, the first thing is we wanted to really define the geriatric patient as 65 or older, and then suggested priorities, again, screening for anticoagulation, and if positive, complete the INR within 30 minutes, and to adopt the CDC recommendations that if the patient is hypotensive is defined as 110 for the geriatric. And then you can see transfer criteria. One of the issues is to look at the ethical issues that go along with that. For example, if you have a patient that has dementia, has signed an advance directive that they do not want care, we probably shouldn't be transferring these patients out of their home environment to another facility. So that's one of the issues to consider. And then clarification that we're talking specifically about transfer from a hospital, not from the nursing home or from the scene or for treatment. Committee members have any comments on this? Individuals from the audience? Comments?
I'll just say we came up with a defined age for geriatrics a hell of a lot quicker than everybody's come up with a defined age for pediatrics.
We did try to tackle that, though. So then we have some pediatric data, and so Lori, I don't know if you're in the room if you want to go through this, but this is the same data, again, that was presented at the November meeting. And so the bottom line is, again, trying to use data to compare, to drive what we're doing within our regions and our state. And so this compares Trauma Service Area E to the state and then to the National Trauma Data Bank. And again, the issues that you'll see is that falls lead, also an increase in child abuse. Lori, Sally, any one of you have any comments? Mary?
That's about right. Yeah, we have seen an increase in child abuse over the last couple of years.
So the same recommendation, again, if you take the current trauma facility criteria for the 3s and 4s, and we add components specific to geriatric, the question that Lori brought up in the meeting was, could we also do the same thing for the pediatrics? And that would make it clear because, again, if you're in those facilities, you do get a lot of pediatric patients, you get geriatric patients, and what needs to be changed based on the age. And so the language, the recommendation was language specific to the pediatric patient population. And again, to look at the additional resources for the facility for pediatrics, and specifically to look at the education for the inpatient areas from the TCAR to the PCAR. And then trauma centers that admit over 100 patients, pediatric patients, then the recommendations with the trauma program manager would have to have an additional 8 hours of pediatric type education. Any comments? Lori, you were there. Mary? Sally?
One of the comments I'll make is, these last couple of slides, at first glance, look like we're going to have to be doing a lot more stuff. But when you sift it all down, we're pretty much doing this stuff already. There's a few things that, if it's a geriatric patient, that we'll have to focus just a little bit tighter on than what we normally do. But and same comment for the pediatrics. But like I say, when you sift it all down, there's not a lot of additional work or additional things that are going to have to be put in place to meet these criteria for these two patient populations.
Lisa, do you want to go through this?
Sure. So basically what we talked about is based upon the data that was presented earlier, that we can identify some injury prevention needs based upon the injury. So falls and motor vehicle crashes, are obviously the things that we would like to focus on. And what we talked about was developing, identifying potential stakeholders that have an interest, a common interest with us for injury prevention, and then identify either current initiatives or initiatives that we could have a partnership with. And some of the stakeholders, of course, for motor vehicle crashes, these are the things that we identified. Young drivers, adult drivers, older drivers, commercial motor vehicle drivers, passengers in vehicles, motorcycle crashes, ATV crash. And kind of on a side note, earlier when we were talking about registry, that is an area where we need a better way to identify those in the registry, because currently there's not a specific injury code that is just for an ATV crash. So that's a difficult, but we can all kind of anecdotally say that we've seen more ATV crashes, and so we need some better data. DWI, texting or distracted driving, whatever they're doing, seatbelt use, unsecured load, and child passenger safety utilization. So those are the kind of the groups that fall under that motor vehicle. So some of the things that we identified for teen and child, there are some things that are already out there that we see as kind of good, ready takeaway. Parkland has an alcohol-related driving program. There's the Shattered Dreams that are in many communities. AT&T texting program. Waco has the Reality Education for Drivers. School programs for seatbelt use. New Mom Pediatric Child Safety Seat Program. Particularly a lot of hospitals have where programs when a mother delivers, they give a child safety seat with that. There was some discussion about potentially investigating and then maybe asking for language to be adding to the licensure rule about newborns not being allowed to be released without an appropriate child passenger safety seat. And apparently there's other states, there's precedents for this in other states, but we didn't believe there's anything currently. I think Jane looked into that, and there isn't anything currently in our licensing rules here in Texas. I'm sure there's other opportunities out there, but these are the ones we were able to identify. And then for adults, distracted driving, we talked a lot about all the types of texting, the doing your hair, eating, reading, your dog sitting there. There are videos perhaps available for those who are renewing their driver's license. One suggestion was in the driver's license office, when you go in, they'll have these little videos, many of them do, and maybe we can add some injury prevention education during that time. Make sure that the defensive driving courses have the most current information. Perhaps also partnering with insurance companies for different injury prevention type activities. There was some other discussion about post-education for partnering with companies like Lowe's and Home Depot and U-Haul about securing cargo, because there have been some injuries where cargo's flown off the back of a moving vehicle into another one, and perhaps there can be some opportunities for some easy education to be done there. You can go to the next one. Geriatric, AARP has a lot, and there might be some opportunities to partner there. We did talk about the issues related to the older driver who may have vision and hearing impairment, and how that could impair their ability to drive. And so perhaps there needs to be some education about referrals to the medical board. The physicians can make those referrals if they can identify that this older patient maybe needs some additional review. That doesn't mean they're going to automatically yank their license, and that's not what they do. They may mean that they have to have a vision test before they can renew, or some additional other types of interventions. And then, of course, partnering with senior care centers, gerontologists, pharmacies, to talk about polypharmacy and how that may affect or potentiate injuries, particularly with like Coumadin or any of those types of medicines, and then having brochures and education done by the gerontologist. Of course, seatbelt use, vehicle safety checklists, those are things that are already, there's programs out there for that. Let's see. Look Twice campaigns, particularly for motorcycle drivers and cyclists, because there have been there's opportunities and there's already programs out there for that. With commercial motor vehicles, many of us have noticed with the increased oil and gas industry, there's also been increased traffic by commercial motor vehicles and increased crashes, and so perhaps there's opportunities to partner with some of those trucking companies to do some education. Let's see, motorcyclists, again, the look twice, helmet usage. Someone also noticed those, have you ever seen those lights that they put on their helmets and they're like going up and down like this, and it's really just awareness for the people who are driving motor vehicles to notice the motorcyclists as safety. ATV, there's a lot of different opportunities there, protective gear, actually supervising children that are on ATVs. You know, they're not really supposed to be riding them anyway, but if you're going to put your child on an ATV, then there needs to be some adult supervision. So that would require, I think someone noted parenting classes. I don't know how we could do on that, but and then here it is talking about the ATV injuries in the registry. Drinking and driving on the ATVs, that's a you know, the hunters, they go out and they're going to have a few beers and drink a few and shoot a few deer and drive a few ATVs, and then they come in crash. Accountability of the landowner where the ATV is being driven. Bicyclists, a lot of the same things we already talked about. Trains versus motor vehicles. There are already some programs out there, and also in some communities there have been some partnerships to make sure that they have those crossing gates that automatically come down. Hazardous materials being transported in vehicles, some education about how to correctly transport hazmat in private vehicles, and also partnering with the commercial motor vehicles to make sure they're correctly placarded and those types of things. You'd be surprised how many are not. That's it.
So did Wanda come in, or Eric, somebody has a thumb drive to talk about the RAC criteria? Okay. She's going to bring it up. So Wanda, can you come up and talk about it?
I can certainly give you the broad stroke of our review of the RAC criteria. The first thing that we noted was in the definitions, 157.2, the Regional Advisory Council is not even identified. So we felt like that was something that we needed to correct, and so we deleted, in our minds, we struck the Regional EMS Trauma System and inserted in its place the Regional Advisory Council, and discussed what that group was. And I can read that definition if you want. So if you guys hit me with food, then I'll know you didn't like it. We said the Regional Advisory Council is a 501c3 nonprofit tax-exempt organization that serves as the DSHS recognized healthcare coalition responsible for the development, implementation, and maintenance of the regional trauma and emergency healthcare system within the geographic region of the trauma service area. The Regional Advisory Council is responsible for collaboration on strategic issues regarding medical resources in all hazards mitigation, planning, response, and recovery activities. The Regional Advisory Council serves as a health oversight agency as referenced in U.S. Code 164.501 with performance improvement responsibilities within the regional trauma and emergency healthcare system. So that was what we added. And then a lot of what we had to do within the Rule 157.122 and 157.123 really was cleanup work. We had a lot of references to the Bureau that we corrected to the department, and changed TDH to Department of State Health Services. So we did a lot of that. There was a fair amount of work in 157.123 because the rule was written so long ago. It really was a primer on how to become a RAC, and we've sort of gotten there. So we deleted pretty much everything that had to do with how to become a RAC and moved more towards identifying how we wanted the plans to work, et cetera. The old rule, as an example, had that we had to have in our plan injury prevention, access to the system, communications, medical oversight, pre-hospital triage criteria, diversion policies, bypass protocols, regional medical control, and regional trauma emergency or treatment guidelines. we actually changed that so it referenced more in line with the model trauma system plan, so that we were talking about injury and illness epidemiology, indicators as a tool for system assessment, statutory authority and administrative rules, system leadership, coalition building and community support, lead agency and human resources, emergency healthcare system plan, system integration and financing, prevention and outreach, EMS, definitive care facilities, system coordination, patient flow, rehabilitation, disaster preparedness, system-wide evaluation and performance improvement, healthcare information management system, and research. We accept that looking at these changes, we are not there. If you look at the way the old rule was written, it really didn't give us a place to strive. So we know that's not going to happen overnight, but it does give us something to work towards. The other thing we did was there was a lot in 157.123 that really was under the RAC component that we felt really was in relation to the individual trauma facility. So it had, as an example, the minimum standards for PI and those sorts of things, and so we deleted that and felt it was more appropriate in the rule dealing with the trauma hospitals, not necessarily the RAC. I will tell you there is some concern that the length of time that it will take to move all of these rules through the process is going to be a little bit slow for some of the things that we're discussing that need to happen, strengthening PI, those sorts of things. We believe there are some things that it would be helpful if we could find alternative ways to move those forward faster.
So, I know Jane's trying to fix the thumb drive, but you know, I think that's one of the biggest questions is, you know, there are many times I see our RAC through the PI process, there's actions that need to be taken, but the question is, what teeth does the RAC have? And so I think all of us, I'd just like to show of hands, raise your hand if you think the RAC should have more teeth or more authority to address some of those issues. Raise your hands. Okay, put your hands down. If you don't think the RAC needs more teeth or authority to address issues, raise your hand.
You do not? I was going to say, that's my chair. No, she was wrong.
Let me repeat that. If you do not think the RAC needs stronger teeth or authority to manage the RAC and the components of system development, raise your hand. So it's pretty unanimous that for those people in the room that we feel like that should take place. So Emily, Jane, any thoughts on how to make that happen, or how can we expedite the process? Because it's my understanding that all the rules that we're talking about may not go into effect until the end of 2013 or 2014.
Wanda, didn't we just talk about that when we were in San Antonio? And I think we kind of came to the conclusion that that would probably take more of a legislative initiative to make us the equivalent of COGS or something. Why am I thinking that?
I'm sorry? Right, we did have discussion about codifying, if that's the correct word, the RAC, and some of that has to do with the whole disaster component and making sure that those RACs are appropriately recognized and are able to then be tasked because of that. Certainly the definition, and I know Jane was checking this out for us, the way we understood the definition for the Health Oversight Agency, we thought that identifying the RACs in that capacity would enable us to do better PI. It may resolve some of the issues with the facilities and the EMS agencies as far as data and those kinds of things. So yes, we did talk about some, you know, was there a potential for some interim legislative kind of work, and I might have to lean back on Dinah to help with that. I don't want you to think that we just revised the rule and took everything else out and gave ourselves a free ride. We didn't. We left in the components about our end-of-year reports and the ways that the Department of State Health Services had oversight and those sorts of things. So we didn't give ourselves a get out of jail free card. I will also tell you, we weren't quite sure how to write in a whole, and I'm going to say designation because I can't think of another word right now. We do not have a current process to survey, designate the racks. We don't foresee a load of money coming soon for that, but we did recognize that we needed to create a system where there was some review and information provided back so that the racks continue to grow and do the right things. So we're not going to drop that, but we weren't quite sure how to put it in here. At this point in time, DSHS is not looking at designating the racks, and initially we went woohoo, but then cooler heads after we ate, then we decided that that was a good internal thing for us to do. So even if that's not something done by the state, we believe that's something that as peer rack organizations we need to create a process for review and feedback.
Any questions for
There's
one?
the definition that we had. To make that way bigger.
Anybody from the committee have questions or comments for Wanda?
Anybody else that was there want to jump in? Questions for us? For any of the racks? This is a really quiet group. So I guess the question does go back to Jane and Emily.
One
about-
person.
Oh,
And I belong to the same rack that Wanda belongs to, so I have a question. Is this changing from a trauma advisory to encompass the whole thing now, everything else? Is this what the definition is going to change now?
This is a suggested definition, okay? The definition will not expand past the authority that is given to us in statute, okay? So 773, everything that they've put into this suggested definition, we need to verify that it does not exceed the statute, okay? And what we've told folks when they're going through this process of reviewing the rule and making suggestions on this is to put in what you want to see. It's up to us to validate that it does not exceed our statutory authority. Some of it may be changed. It may come back and say, okay, this piece needs to be edited, okay? But that's up to us to feed back to the people that have worked on this and say, this is what we want to see. This is what we think, and this is what we think the industry needs, where the industry needs to go.
Good enough.
Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
it certainly does beg the question, and you'll see a lot of places where we use the words regional trauma and emergency healthcare system. Because of all of the work that is being done by the stroke committee, by the cardiac committee, by pediatric committee, we wanted to make sure as we look at what the RACs are actually doing, that we encompass that. And we tried to use words that we thought would stay within the statutory authority, but we wanted to make sure that we came up with a definition and verbiage that supports the activities of GETAC and allows us to do that work.
So Jane, I think one question that we need to ask is, it's my perspective that the RAC needs its own committee off of GETAC to address these issues. So not necessarily be linked specifically to the Trauma Systems Committee. And I know they're linked that way because of the old rules. But the question is, when we move forward, is there an opportunity for that recommendation to happen?
Well, Jory, I think that's going to be part of the strategic planning that the council is doing. because in its strategic planning session in October, the council talked about what do we need to be, what's the makeup, and what do we need to be able to accomplish. So I really think that's going to be driven by the members of the council, because they have identified strategic goals and they're developing plans on how they get to those goals. So I think that's still part of that discussion. Some of the pitfalls for doing that is that you know that the committees of GETAC operate under the open meetings requirements. And so that, you know, it's kind of a double-edged sword. Do we want to go that direction with a RAC committee that has to operate under those conditions? Maybe the answer is yes, maybe it's not. Maybe there's some hybrid, I'm not sure.
Coincidentally, in my report to GETAC on Friday, that is going to be a recommendation that comes from the RACs, that there be a separate RAC committee. And part of the reason for that is there is such strong work that is done in all of the committees that needs to be implemented, that we would like to have a way that we look at all of those initiatives, that they are prioritized, and that we have some good statewide rollout of some of those. And we need the RACs to do that. And so we will come forward with that recommendation. I think we need to be clear. It's sometimes because we have TTCF and we have TTAF and we have GTAC and we have the RACs, that there's a lot of overlap and sometimes blurring of the lines. And I don't want anybody to be confused that, as an example, the RAC chairs meeting would be mixed with what a GTAC committee would do. The RAC chairs meeting is a contractual meeting. It is not a way that we roll out initiatives to the state. So in our minds, they are separate lanes. And it certainly would be up to us to make sure that they stayed separate lanes. But yes, that will come as a recommendation on Friday.
Thank you. Any committee members have any comments on that? Any questions from the audience? Okay, so if you go back and look at the agenda, the second item on the agenda was to look at the PI issue. So in the first couple of slides, we talked about the performance standards and then the event review for the level 3, for the level 4 facilities. And when we talk about that, one thing that's important to remember that every level 1 and every level 2 trauma center has to meet the same criteria that the level 3s do. So all those criteria would obviously go into the level 1s and the level 2s as well. So
Joy, one of the things we talked about yesterday at the Texas Trauma Coordinators Forum was they established a work group that included a representative from a level 1, a 2, a 3, a 4, make sure that rural, frontier, urban was covered, a registrar person, an EMS person, to take what was on those first couple of slides and further digest them, talk about them, polish them, whatever needs to be done. And that I've already had several volunteers for that work group, to the point where just about all those slots are filled. And we'll probably be talking more about that via conference call as a Texas Trauma Coordinator Forum work group.
Okay. So the question would be for the Trauma Systems Committee and the committee members, do we want to take any actions on the recommendations today or wait for that group to come back to us?
The goal would be is that the May meeting, a formal recommendation from that group would be presented to this committee.
Is there a motion for this particular issue, item number 2?
I'll move. That TTCF review this and bring this back to the May meeting.
Okay. Any second? Any further discussion? All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Anyone opposed? Okay. Item number 2 is to look at the trauma registry validation. So any comments from the committee members? Any comments from anybody in the audience? Just please state your name.
Hi, I'm Rudy Flores. I just did want to remind everyone, when we talk about data validation and extraction from the registry, with the new registry that's going to be rolling out and the implementation of ICD-10 CM coming in October of 2013, that data may be coming. I know that you're looking for specific ATV-related crashes. With the ICD-10 CM implementation, there will be a specific code to say ATV or distracted driving. So I did want to make sure, I don't know what the plans are yet as far as accepting ICD-10, but the possibility is there.
Thank you, Rudy. Any other comments from the group? Tammy?
We did receive the feedback about needing a specific code for ATV, also for horse and bull events, either riding, thrown off, that sort of thing. We've already added those, so I just wanted to let you know that.
Good.
So you'll still report ICD 9 or 10, and in addition, you will answer a question to specify if you chose the category in ICD 9 or 10 that has all of these things combined, like a tank and a hovercraft and ATV. There's another question that says, was this an ATV, yes or no? There's another question for bulls. There's another question for horses.
Any additional discussion on the validation of the trauma registry?
Did we ever decide when the drop dead date was going to be that we all started using ICD-10? And do we need to talk about that further?
Tammy, that would probably come from your office.
To repeat, Tammy, I was just asking if there was a defined drop dead, everybody's got to start using ICD-10.
No,
date.
we know that hospitals are under some regulations to start using it, and EMS as well, but we also recognize that not everybody on the same day will start using it. So what we're doing is we're accepting the current file format, which uses ICD-9. So if people don't have time or money to have their vendor change their software until further down the road, they'll be able to continue to send that file. We'll know that it's ICD-9 because they're continuing to send that same file, although we have heard that some people are sending us, for instance, AIS scores using a different standard than what is in our current schema. And so we will try to follow up with people and make sure that they tell us. In the new registry, there is a question that says, are you using ICD-9 or are you using ICD-10? So even if you get your software upgraded and you're able to send us the new file, we'll still ask you which one of those are you using. We'll also ask you which version of AIS you're using, so that when we go to analyze the data, we'll be able to properly do that. So we're not dictating that you have to use 9 or 10 by any certain date. And we're having the flexibility that you could use either, as long as you're indicating to us which one of those it is. I mean, it's pretty clear on the ICD 9 and 10. AIS isn't as clear.
Any other questions, comments? If you'll look at this, the slide, these are the recommendations that we were asking this group for the quarterly reports from the registry. This is from the state. So the first one was how many site surveys were completed and how many required follow-up. So we're asking for this on a quarterly basis. The number of hospitals participating in the trauma registry, the condition on discharge, the billed hospital charges annually. We also asked for the number of hospitals and number of records that enter a zero charge. I feel like that skews the data. And the most frequent non-fatal ECodes every 6 months. The hospital discharge dispositions every 6 months. The top 5 non-fatal injury categories and top 5 codes for fatal injury categories quarterly. The non-fatal by age group and fatal by age group quarterly. ISS by reporting hospitals and level of trauma centers every 6 months. The ISS average length of stay for level of trauma centers every 6 months. Geriatric data every 6 months, pediatric data every 6 months, data regarding inpatient death versus ED deaths, how many traumatic brain injuries, amputations, spinal cord injuries occur every 6 months, 6 months, and then patients with trauma center greater than 30 days, payer source for all patients every 6 months, and then the number of patients that go home from the ED, OR, ICU. I'm not sure what it is. Information. So that was what the committee met, when they met in January, asked specifically for that type of data. I just wanted to open that up for discussion.
And the intent for those various reports, that they would be sent out every 6 months, and based on what that data showed would drive initiatives that trauma systems or some of the other GETAC committees may need to work on. Identify opportunities, improvements in the system, needed improvements in the system.
I personally believe data drives the system. You need to know where you're at before you can improve the system.
I'm just curious, I guess this is a question for Tammy. What is the anticipated lag time? If we ask for 6 months of data, is that going to be the prior year? Is it going to be the prior 18 months? Or, you know, what?
It's going to depend on when you want to start implementing this. When we go live in August of 2013 is when we're really going to, 2012, is when we're really going to start contacting people. You probably get sick of hearing from us because if we haven't got your data, we're just going to hound you until we get it. And, right now, if we tried to do this, basically what it would be pointing out to you is how many people don't report on a regular basis. So it just depends on when you want to start this, on what the data would look like. Also depends on what you want to define as the 6 months. Is it, the first 6 months of the year? When do you start? So if you can give me that, if someone can send me the slides that you all have today, because we actually next week start our training and creating our own reports that we're able, and most of these we can create ourselves. We don't have to have our software vendor do it. So we can create those so that they're in the system, so that anybody could run them whenever they wanted, as well as us giving you a report on whatever prescribed schedule that you would like to be on. Agree with Jory and the committee, data does drive the system. If you want to change something, measure it. So that's what we need to do, and we're more than happy to provide you with all of the data that you want. So don't ever be afraid that it's too much, because it's not too much. This is what we do. So happy to give you all of that. We
So
just need to
you
work out the
anticipate
details.
with the new registry that we'll be able to run concurrent and month-by-month reports? Once
Yeah,
it's up
I
and
would
running
even
and there's
suggest
data?
that we look at this stuff quarterly, to be honest with you. And tie it in maybe with whatever schedules that you might have for things related to designation. So I think we probably need to have some brainstorming sessions with you to get down to exactly what would meet your needs, and we'll just do that.
Okay. Anyone from the audience have any comments on these recommendations? Does the committee want to take any actions on these recommendations and this validation recommendations?
Let's see, I'll make a motion that the trauma systems, GETAC trauma systems subcommittee, forward these registry validation recommendations, performance recommendations, and report recommendations to the GETAC Council to be considered for inclusion into the current rule revision process and/or any identified legislative opportunities.
Okay. Can you repeat that?
You might, sorry.
Is there a second?
I basically said, I'm sorry. I'll try to repeat it. I'll try to repeat it even faster this time.
I have
Okay. The thumbnail version is that this subcommittee push forward the trauma registry recommendations for performance and the trauma registry recommendations for reports to the GETAC Council to be considered and during the rule revision process and or if there are any legislative creation opportunities.
Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, Dr. Smith, second. Any discussion? All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Anyone opposed, please say aye. Motion carries. Now, the next recommendation is the geriatric, and so again, the committee would like to move forward with the recommendation to add specific criteria to the current trauma system recommendations. I mean, it's current trauma center criteria. If you look in the minutes, you can see the specific, and I can also forward to you the recommendations. Does the committee want to take action on those recommendations? Any comments from the audience before we make a motion on this or decide to take action on the geriatric criteria?
I think, before we make a motion, I think this would fit well with that trauma coordinators work group. I think they could take some of these recommendations too and include them in their formal recommendation in May, just so that we have got their input. And like I say, be prepared to have a formal recommendation from that work group in May.
Do you want trauma medical directors to comment on it too?
The one group I'm thinking I left out was trauma medical directors. We were going to do that by conference call. Dr. Daniel, Dr. Smith, can I include one or both of you guys in that conference call? We hadn't set the date or anything yet, just so I have that medical director perspective insight.
So we'll leave that pending? No further action from this committee?
Pending their recommendations.
Kind of collaboration of two recommendations.
And what about the pediatric criteria? Same?
Same.
Okay. Now, the host of items that Lisa went over with you. Yes, Sal. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, we were, but nobody could agree on it. I'm ready. If you're older than 15, you're an adult. How do you like that?
Amen.
I love that opinion. Okay. Do we have a motion on that?
I'll move.
I'll make that motion. That we define pediatrics
Yeah.
as less than 15.
Is
Less
there
than 16. Because our rec defines it as 15 years.
15th birthday, right? Can we say, somebody has a motion, sorry.
Define pediatrics as age less than 15. 15 and up is adults. 14, 365 is, or 364 is peds. Define pediatrics
15,
as
365.
up to 14, 364. You turn 15 and you're an adult.
Is there
That's the ACS definition.
is there a second?
I'm a second it.
Any discussion?
Audience.
How are other recs defining it?
18 up to many, there's many.
Any discussion from anybody in the audience? There's a hand up. Please define who you are.
My name is Jorge Sainz. I'm the medical director of the pediatric ICU, in one of the pediatric ICUs in El Paso. The problem that we usually see once we assign a date to pediatric patients, and correct me if I'm stepping over my boundaries, is that if they go to an adult hospital, okay, and they'll be 15 and 3 months. Usually, what we see in El Paso sometimes is that when they are not receiving, trauma services. Trauma services is not a problem. They're always going to find a surgeon that is going to take the spleen out. But the problem that we usually see in El Paso is that when those patients that are, between 15 to 18, that they require other services, such as, pulmonary services, or, somebody that needs to get a bronchoscopy or an infectious diseases consult or anything else. The adult subspecialists, usually, at least in our city, are reluctant to see these patients. So that, having to find a surgeon that is going to take care of them on the acute trauma center is never an issue. It's what comes along with everything else, once those patients are admitted to the, adult ICU and so forth and so on. So that is the only hesitance that I can, pose to this committee as far as, setting up an age like that. If in San Antonio where I train, we usually never had that problem, because those patients came to the pediatric ICU, and the pediatric ICU services provided those services along with the pediatric subspecialists. But in El Paso, it has been a problem, when you're looking for a consult, and in my opinion, right then and then, the pediatric patients don't get the same level of care of adults, just because of an age difference. It has nothing to do with body weight. It has nothing to do with anything else. So it's just out there for you folks to consider.
Any comments from the committee regarding his comments?
That can be a medical staff issue. That can be defined in your medical staff bylaws, that if you are on, you are on.
I'd like to add to his. We've actually explored this as well, and there was a problem with malpractice insurance and risk management of what the age cutoff is, and our intensivist and that our pulmonologists, all of our ancillary services, subspecialists, and their malpractice insurance was greater than the age of 17, which would cause them to carry additional coverage. And so it brought up a large discussion, and they essentially have put it back in our arena about whether or not they're going to take those. And then if you have that age group, your ICU, what age group goes there, and are those nurses trained for pediatrics? So the can of worms just kept opening up as we were exploring this. And we did validate the malpractice insurance from our pulmonology group for event management of these patients, and it definitely was greater than 17. Not saying we couldn't do it, it's just going to take additional resources in order to keep those patients.
Yeah, we've had that problem in our institution too, in terms of getting pulmonary consults on anybody under 18. So I've had to transfer out kids that we're willing to take care of. As trauma surgeons, we're willing to take care of them, but we can't get consults from pulmonologists to manage, let's say, a kid with really bad asthma that's on a vent. And I just transferred a 15-year-old out last month for that reason.
Any other comments from the audience? Any comments from the committee? If not, we're going to call the question. The motion is that the pediatric age will be 15 years of age. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Raise your hands so I can count your names. 1, 2, 3, 6. 6 for. Those opposed? 1, 2.
No, it was a 4.
Okay. All right. Looks like the motion carries, age 15.
No, we'll still have to transfer them out.
It's a starting place. Item number 5 was the injury prevention activities that Lisa went over. Again, if you remember, you were here in November. The discussion was to identify those opportunities for injury prevention and to work with the TTAF Injury Prevention Division as well as the Texas Trauma Coordinators Division, committee, and then to work with the Injury Prevention Committee for GETAC to take those recommendations to those organizations and develop collaborative practices to address those issues. So any other discussion or actions to take on those?
I think this subcommittee should approve those recommendations and forward them to the injury prevention. I think they're calling themselves the Coalition, which includes Texas Trauma Coordinators Forum, Texas EMS and Acute Care Foundation, and GETAC representation, and let them develop programs based on those recommendations.
Is that a motion?
Yes.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Any discussion? Any discussion from the audience? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Motion carries. And the other issue was the DWI, looking at the state initiatives, and we're still in a searching mode on that, looking at recommendations from the state of all the activities that are going on through the law enforcement, through the legal system, and so we'll have to bring that information back to you. The next item on the agenda is the RAC criteria that Wanda presented. So from this committee, again, is there actions that we want to take forward? Do we want to move those recommendations to GTAC?
So moved.
Lisa made a motion to do it. Yeah. Dr. Daniels said second. Any discussion from the committee members? Any discussion from the audience? All those
I'm assuming RAC chairs will talk about this sometime this evening. Yes? No? What do you think, Emily? Can they? What Wanda went over a while ago, will that be discussed at RAC chairs tonight, or is there opportunity, or? Okay.
Okay. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Motion carries. So now we move into the council reports, the committee member reports. Dr. Stewart's not here. Mr. Christopher, anything from the Texas Trauma Coordinators Forum that you have not brought up?
Let's see. Since this group met in November, their board has met, their general membership has met. A couple of the highlights of what they're doing is they have identified that 2012 is the 20th anniversary for two things. One, Texas Trauma Systems, and also the creation of the Texas Trauma Coordinators Forum. So they're talking about ways to celebrate that. At the meeting yesterday, they heard two excellent.
You have 4 minutes left.
Okay. Two excellent lectures on or presentations on one on burn care, one on using registry data. Both of those were from military providers. Excellent. Got their routine updates, set their meeting dates for this year. They did identify that they're going to change their pediatric subcommittee to a special population subcommittee, and their injury prevention groups wants to focus on falls, ground level falls, and then last but not least, they named their outstanding trauma person for the year, and that person, based on their obtaining level 3 or near obtainment of level 3 designation for a pediatric hospital, and the commitment and the mentoring and the dedication she's given to the Texas Trauma Coordinators Forum for several years, Janet Pointer was named as the outstanding person of the year.
Janet, we understand you're going to be leaving Texas.
I am. Just for a couple of years, I'll be back.
Congratulations. Congratulations on your award. The level 4 trauma facilities, Deborah, would you just stand up for a second? All the level 4s in the room, if you need to make the Trauma Systems Committee aware of an issue, Deborah's your contact, Deborah and Jackie. Jackie, they know you, but you want to say hi. The level 3 contacts is going to be Dr. Daniels and Miss Lisa. If you have any issues, please make them aware.
Jory?
Yes, sir.
Is there a way we could get a email list?
I'll send some.
So
I
that
got
we
something
could
from the state.
Send out queries and
Sure.
see if anyone has any issues?
I'll send you what I have. And then level 2s is Dr. Ryan and Dr. Smith. Level 1s will be Dr. Eastridge and myself. And then the pediatric trauma centers, raise your hand, Ms. Frost. Ms. Price will address the issues and concerns for the trauma division of TTAF. Angela Fisher, who's not here, is the ACEP EMS. Jose?
Yes, ma'am.
Raise your hand. He's going to represent EMS if you have any issues from EMS. And then Ms. Welch in the back will be our liaison for TTAF. At this time, we have like 1 minute left. Is there any comments from anybody in the committee? Anything from anybody in the audience that you want to make us aware of that we have not discussed today?
I'd like to say something to the trauma program managers. Please remind your trauma medical directors that we need them more involved in this process. So when you get back, prod your medical directors. If they're not coming to RAC meetings, get them going to RAC meetings and get them involved in GETAC.
Anybody else have any comments? Is there a motion to adjourn? Let the record reflect we have 1 minute left. Thank you.